The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Isabella made her way through the eastern corridor. Her silk gown rustled against the polished stone, and her jeweled crown caught the light streaming through the tall windows. She had ruled the kingdom of Aldermere for 15 years, ever since her husband King Frederick had passed away, leaving their son Prince Alexander as heir to the throne. Isabella paused before a portrait of her late husband, her fingers tracing the golden frame. The kingdom had prospered under her rule, but lately tensions had been rising. The nobility questioned her decisions. The common people grew restless with new taxes, and worst of all, her own son had begun to challenge her authority in the royal council meetings. "Your Majesty," came a gentle voice from behind her. Isabella turned to see Lady Margaret, her most trusted adviser, approaching with a concerned expression. "The prince has requested to speak with you in the throne room." Isabella's jaw tightened. Alexander had been growing more bold in his criticisms of her policies, especially regarding the increased military spending and the new trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms. At 28 years old, he believed he was ready to take the throne. But Isabella knew he lacked the wisdom that only came with experience. "Tell him I will see him after the morning council session," Isabella replied coldly. "Your Majesty." "He said it was urgent," Lady Margaret pressed gently. Isabella's eyes flashed with irritation. "Everything is urgent with him these days. He can wait like everyone else." As they walked toward the throne room, Isabella noticed the palace guards standing at attention along the walls. Captain Marcus, her head of security for over a decade, nodded respectfully as she passed. These men had served her faithfully through numerous crises, from attempted coups to foreign invasions. They understood the weight of responsibility that came with ruling a kingdom. The throne room doors opened with a heavy creak, revealing the grand chamber where Isabella held court each morning. The massive room was designed to intimidate, with its soaring ceiling painted with scenes of past victories and its walls lined with the banners of noble houses. At the far end sat the golden throne, elevated on a platform of white marble steps. Isabella took her place on the throne, adjusting her crown as Lady Margaret announced the beginning of the morning session. Various nobles and officials filed in to present their petitions and reports. Lord Bartholomew spoke of grain shortages in the northern provinces, while Duke Edmund requested additional funds for road repairs. Isabella listened with practiced patience, making decisions with the authority of someone who had dealt with these matters for years. Halfway through the session, the doors burst open without announcement. Prince Alexander strode into the room, his dark hair slightly disheveled and his blue eyes blazing with determination. The assembled nobles fell silent, sensing the tension that immediately filled the air. Alexander wore his formal royal attire, but his posture suggested barely contained frustration. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying across the vast room without the usual formal address of "Your Majesty." The breach of protocol did not go unnoticed by anyone present. Isabella's grip tightened on the armrests of her throne. "Prince Alexander, you know better than to interrupt the formal session. These matters require proper procedure." "Some matters are more important than procedure," Alexander replied, stepping closer to the throne platform. "We need to discuss the situation in the Eastern Territories immediately." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. The Eastern Territories had been experiencing unrest due to recent tax increases, and several minor uprisings had been reported. Isabella had ordered increased patrols and stricter enforcement, but Alexander had argued for a more diplomatic approach. "The situation is under control," Isabella stated firmly. "Captain Marcus has assured me that order will be restored within the week." Alexander's eyes flicked toward Captain Marcus, who stood stoically near the wall with several other guards. The captain's expression remained neutral, but Alexander could see the uncertainty in his eyes. The reality was that the situation in the East was far worse than Isabella wanted to admit. "Mother, with respect, your information is outdated," Alexander said, his voice rising slightly. "I've received reports that 3 more villages have joined the uprising. The people are not just angry about taxes, they're questioning the legitimacy of our rule." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several nobles gasped audibly, and Isabella's face turned pale with rage. To question the legitimacy of royal rule in open court was tantamount to treason, even coming from the heir apparent. "How dare you?" Isabella whispered, her voice deadly quiet. "How dare you undermine my authority in front of the court?" Alexander realized he had crossed a line, but he pressed on. "The truth is not undermining, Mother. It's necessary. If we don't address the real problems, we'll face a full rebellion." Isabella stood slowly from her throne, her royal robes flowing behind her like a dark storm cloud. The assembled nobles took an unconscious step backward, sensing the fury radiating from their queen. Even Lady Margaret looked concerned, knowing that Isabella's temper could lead to consequences that would echo throughout the kingdom. "You forget yourself." "Alexander," Isabella said, her voice now carrying the full weight of royal authority, "I have ruled this kingdom while you were still learning to hold a sword. I have made the difficult decisions that kept our people safe and our borders secure. I will not be lectured by a boy who thinks reading reports makes him wise." The insult struck Alexander like a physical blow. Around the room he could see the faces of nobles, advisors, and guards watching this family drama unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed almost eager to witness the confrontation between mother and son. But all of them were judging, measuring, deciding which side they would support if this conflict escalated further. Alexander's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had come here hoping to have a reasonable discussion about the kingdom's problems, but his mother's arrogance and dismissive attitude had turned it into a public humiliation. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the room upon him, waiting to see how he would respond to being called a foolish boy in front of the entire court. The silence stretched on, heavy with unspoken tensions and the weight of a kingdom's future hanging in the balance between a stubborn queen and her increasingly frustrated heir. Alexander's jaw tightened as his mother's words echoed through the throne room. The insult burned deeper because it was delivered in front of the entire court, witnessed by nobles who would spread this story throughout the kingdom within hours. He had served in the royal army, led successful diplomatic missions to 3 neighboring kingdoms, and spent countless hours studying the art of governance. Yet Isabella continued to treat him as if he were still a child playing with wooden swords in the palace gardens. "A boy, Mother?" Alexander's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "Is that what you called father when he was my age and already commanding armies?" The comparison to her late husband struck Isabella like a dagger. Frederick had indeed been a young leader, ascending to the throne at 26 when his father died unexpectedly. But the situations were different, she told herself. Frederick had faced external enemies, not the complex internal politics that now threatened Aldermere. "Your father earned his authority through battle," Isabella snapped. "He didn't gain it by questioning his queen in open court." Lord Bartholomew shifted uncomfortably near the front of the assembled nobles. As one of the kingdom's oldest advisors, he had served under both Frederick and Isabella. He remembered the young Prince Frederick, passionate and sometimes reckless, challenging his own father's cautious approach to warfare. The irony was not lost on him, and he caught the eye of Duke Edmund, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement of the same thought. Alexander took a step closer to the throne platform, his boots clicking against the marble floor. Father also didn't ignore the voices of his people when they cried out for justice. "The Eastern Territories aren't rebelling because they're ungrateful, Mother. They're rebelling because they're starving." "Starving?" Isabella laughed bitterly. "The harvest reports show adequate grain stores. The people have food." "The harvest reports are wrong," Alexander said flatly. "I've been there, Mother. I've seen the empty granaries and the children with hollow cheeks. I've spoken to farmers whose land has been seized for unpaid taxes that were raised 3 times in 2 years. Captain Marcus straightened slightly at his post near the wall. He had received similar reports from his men stationed in the Eastern Territories, but Isabella had dismissed them as exaggerations from soldiers who spent too much time listening to peasant complaints. The truth was that Marcus had begun to worry about the loyalty of his own men in those regions, as they witnessed firsthand the suffering of the common people they were supposed to protect. "You spoke to farmers?" Isabella's voice dripped with disdain. Since when does a prince lower himself to peasant gossip? The question revealed everything wrong with Isabella's rule, and Alexander seized upon it. Since this prince remembered that peasants are also our subjects, mother. Father used to say that a king who doesn't know his people cannot truly serve them. Another reference to Frederick. Another reminder of the king Isabella had lost and the standard by which she was being measured. The assembled court watched this verbal duel with fascination, understanding that they were witnessing a fundamental shift in the kingdom's power structure. Some of the younger nobles found themselves nodding slightly at Alexander's words, while the older generation remained loyal to the queen, who had guided them through 15 years of relative stability. Lady Margaret stood frozen near the throne, torn between her loyalty to Isabella and her growing concern about the kingdom's future. She had access to reports that neither the queen nor the prince had seen, intelligence from her network of informants throughout Aldermere. The situation was indeed worse than Isabella believed, but not quite as desperate as Alexander claimed. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between the two extremes. "Your father is dead," Isabella said coldly, ending any pretense of maternal warmth. "I am your queen, and I will not tolerate this disrespect any longer. Guards." The command rang through the throne room, but something unprecedented happened. The guards, led by Captain Marcus, remained motionless at their posts. They had heard every word of the heated exchange, witnessed the Queen's dismissal of legitimate concerns about their fellow citizens' welfare, and seen the prince's genuine passion for the kingdom's well-being. For the first time in their years of faithful service, they found themselves questioning whether their loyalty belonged to the crown or to the people they had sworn to protect. Isabella's face went white with shock. "Captain Marcus, I gave you an order." Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face showing the strain of divided loyalties. "Your Majesty, what exactly do you wish us to do?" "The prince has committed no crime. He has simply voiced his concerns about the welfare of your subjects." The words were carefully chosen, diplomatic, but they carried a clear message. Marcus would not arrest the heir apparent for speaking truth to power. Around the room, the other guards seemed to share their captain's sentiment, standing at attention but making no move toward Alexander. "He has shown disrespect to his sovereign," Isabella insisted, her voice rising with desperation as she realized her authority was being challenged not just by her son, but by the very men who were supposed to enforce her will. "With respect, Your Majesty," Marcus replied slowly, "I have heard nothing but a prince expressing love for his kingdom and concern for his future subjects." The silence that followed was deafening. Never in the history of Aldermere had guards openly defied a direct royal command. Yet here they stood, motionless and resolute. Isabella looked around the throne room, seeking support from the assembled nobles, but found only carefully neutral expressions and averted gazes. Even her most loyal supporters were beginning to question whether her harsh treatment of Alexander was in the kingdom's best interests. Alexander felt a surge of both gratitude and terror. He had not intended for this confrontation to escalate to the point where the royal guard was choosing sides, but their silent support gave him the courage to continue pressing his case. "Mother," he said, his voice softer now but no less determined, "I'm not trying to undermine you. I'm trying to help you see that the kingdom needs change. The old ways of ruling through fear and isolation are no longer working." Isabella's hands trembled with rage as she gripped the armrests of her throne. She had spent 15 years building her authority, making the difficult decisions that kept Aldermere stable and prosperous. Now her own son, supported by guards who had sworn loyalty to her crown, was systematically dismantling everything she had worked to establish. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Get out of my sight before I find guards who still remember their duty." Alexander stood his ground despite his mother's command to leave. The throne room felt electric with tension, as if the very air itself was charged with the conflict between royal tradition and necessary change. He could see the fear in Isabella's eyes now, beneath all the rage and wounded pride. She was beginning to understand that her absolute authority was not as absolute as she had believed. "I will not leave, Mother," Alexander said quietly. Not when my kingdom needs me to speak the truth. The words "my kingdom" did not go unnoticed by anyone present. It was a subtle but unmistakable declaration that Alexander saw himself not as a prince waiting for his inheritance, but as a future king actively concerned about his realm. Several of the younger nobles exchanged glances, and even some of the older lords began to reconsider their positions. Isabella rose from her throne, her face flushed with a mixture of fury and desperation. "Your kingdom? You arrogant child. I am the queen. This is my kingdom, earned through years of sacrifice and difficult decisions that you could never understand." "Then help me understand," Alexander replied, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of openness. "Explain to me how letting our people starve serves the greater good. Tell me how ignoring the cries of our subjects makes us better rulers. Help me see how ruling through fear instead of love strengthens our crown." Lord Bartholomew could no longer remain silent. As the eldest member of the court, he had witnessed the reigns of 3 monarchs and understood the delicate balance required to maintain both authority and popular support. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "perhaps we should consider the prince's concerns. The Eastern territories have always been difficult to govern, but the current unrest seems more serious than previous disturbances." Isabella whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "Lord Bartholomew, are you now taking counsel from children over your rightful queen?" The old lord straightened his shoulders, showing the backbone that had made him valuable to 3 generations of rulers. "I take counsel from wisdom, Your Majesty, regardless of its source." The prince raises valid points that deserve consideration. Duke Edmund nodded in agreement. "The prince has visited the Eastern territories recently. Perhaps his perspective offers valuable insights we have not considered." Isabella felt the foundation of her support crumbling beneath her feet. These were men who had advised her for years, who had helped her navigate the complex challenges of ruling after Frederick's death. Now they were openly supporting her son's challenge to her authority. Captain Marcus watched this exchange with growing concern. His loyalty had always been to the crown and the kingdom it represented, but he was beginning to see a fundamental conflict between those 2 allegiances. The crown demanded obedience to Isabella's increasingly harsh policies, while the kingdom's welfare seemed to require the kind of reform Alexander was advocating. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully, "my men in the Eastern territories report that the situation is indeed more serious than our previous assessments suggested. Perhaps a diplomatic mission, led by the prince, could help restore order without further military intervention." Isabella felt as though the entire world was conspiring against her. Her son, her advisors, her guards, even her most trusted allies were now questioning her judgment and supporting Alexander's position. The isolation was suffocating, but it only strengthened her resolve to maintain control. "Diplomatic mission?" She laughed harshly. "You want me to reward his disrespect by giving him authority over a critical situation? He has shown nothing but contempt for my rule, and you suggest I hand him more power?" Alexander stepped forward again, his voice earnest and sincere. "Mother, this isn't about power or reward. It's about doing what's best for our people. If you don't trust me to handle this situation, then come with me. Let us go together to the Eastern territories and see the truth for ourselves." The suggestion caught Isabella off guard. The idea of leaving the palace, of venturing into the troubled regions where her policies were being challenged, filled her with anxiety. She had ruled from the comfort and security of the throne room for so long that the prospect of facing her subjects directly seemed almost foreign to her. "Queens do not go begging for approval from rebellious peasants," she said dismissively. "Our authority comes from God and bloodline, not from the approval of common people." "Father didn't think that way," Alexander said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "He walked among our people, listened to their concerns, and earned their respect through his actions. That's why they followed him into battle, why they mourned his death, and why they still speak his name with reverence." Lady Margaret finally found her voice, though it trembled with emotion. "Your Majesty, perhaps the prince speaks wisdom. King Frederick did indeed maintain strong connections with all levels of society. It was one of his greatest strengths as a ruler. Isabella turned on her oldest friend and adviser with venom in her eyes. "Et tu, Margaret? Even you turn against me in favor of this? This naive idealist who thinks ruling a kingdom is as simple as listening to complaints and offering sympathy?" Margaret's face showed genuine pain at the accusation, but she stood firm. "I do not turn against you, Isabella. I speak out of concern for both you and the kingdom we all serve. The prince offers a path forward that could strengthen rather than weaken your reign." The throne room fell silent again, but this time the quiet was different. It was not the tense silence of conflict, but the contemplative quiet of people processing a fundamental shift in their understanding. Alexander could see it in their faces, the growing realization that change was not only necessary but inevitable. "You all think I'm wrong," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You all believe this boy knows better than the woman who has kept this kingdom stable for 15 years. Alexander's expression softened as he saw the genuine hurt beneath his mother's anger. "Mother, you have done incredible things for Aldermere. You held the kingdom together when father died. You negotiated peace with our enemies, and you strengthened our defenses against external threats. But the challenges we face now are different. They require different approaches." "Different approaches," Isabella repeated bitterly. "You mean weak approaches? You want me to compromise with rebels, to show weakness in the face of defiance?" "I want you to show strength," Alexander replied firmly. "Real strength comes from confidence in your rule, confidence that allows you to listen to criticism without feeling threatened by it. Father taught me that a strong ruler serves the people, not the other way around." Captain Marcus found himself nodding almost involuntarily. The prince's words echoed the oath he had taken when he first became a guard, to protect not just the crown, but the kingdom and its people. He began to see that supporting Alexander might be the highest form of loyalty to the realm he had sworn to serve. Isabella stared at her son, seeing not the little boy who once ran through the palace halls chasing butterflies, but a man whose convictions had crystallized into something that threatened everything she thought she knew about ruling. The weight of 15 years on the throne suddenly felt crushing, as though every decision she had made was being scrutinized and found wanting by people who had never faced the impossible choices that came with absolute responsibility. "You speak of your father as..." "Though he was perfect," Isabella said, her voice taking on a dangerous edge. "But Frederick made mistakes too. His compassion nearly cost us the war with the northern tribes. His trust in diplomatic solutions almost left our borders defenseless when King Roland's armies massed at our gates." Alexander felt a flash of anger at hearing his father's memory attacked, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Father's compassion also secured lasting peace with those same northern tribes, Mother. His diplomacy turned potential enemies into trading partners. Those weren't mistakes, they were investments in our kingdom's future." Duke Edmund cleared his throat, drawing attention to himself as he stepped forward. "Your Majesty, if I may speak plainly, both perspectives have merit. King Frederick's approach had its risks, just as your approach has had its successes. Perhaps the wisdom lies in combining the best of both methods." Isabella's eyes narrowed as she focused on the Duke. "Combining methods? You mean compromising my authority to appease those who would challenge royal prerogative?" "I mean adapting your leadership style to meet current challenges," Duke Edmund replied respectfully but firmly. "The Eastern territories aren't rebelling against the crown itself, Your Majesty. They're rebelling against policies that they feel are unjust." "There's a difference." Lord Bartholomew nodded in agreement. "The Duke speaks truth, Your Majesty. In my years of service, I've learned that the strongest rulers are those who can distinguish between challenges to their person and challenges to their policies. One is treason, the other is simply governance." Isabella felt the conversation slipping further from her control. These men, who had stood by her through countless crises, were now openly discussing the need for her to change her fundamental approach to ruling. It felt like betrayal, but worse than that, it felt like abandonment. "So you all believe I should bow to the demands of rebels?" Isabella asked, her voice rising with incredulity. You think I should reward their defiance by giving them what they want? Captain Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face showing the strain of divided loyalties. Your Majesty, with respect, they're not demanding the impossible. They want fair taxation, adequate food supplies, and some voice in the policies that affect their daily lives. These are reasonable requests from loyal subjects, not treasonous demands from enemies. Reasonable? Isabella laughed bitterly. Since when do subjects negotiate with their sovereigns? Since when do common people have the right to question royal policy? Alexander felt the moment crystallizing around him, understanding that this was the crucial point where either meaningful change would begin, or the kingdom would fracture irreparably. Since we became their servants instead of their masters, mother. The crown exists to serve the kingdom, not the other way around. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down between them. Isabella's face went white with shock at what she saw as a ultimate heresy, the idea that royal authority was conditional upon the consent of the governed. Servants? Isabella whispered, her voice trembling with rage. We are not servants. We are chosen by God to rule. We are the divine representatives of order and justice. How dare you suggest that we should grovel for the approval of peasants and merchants? Lady Margaret stepped closer to the throne, her voice gentle but firm. Isabella, dear friend, no one suggests groveling. But even divine authority must be exercised with wisdom and compassion. The greatest kings and queens in history were those who understood that true power comes from the willing loyalty of their subjects, not from their fear. Isabella turned to stare at her oldest friend, seeing a stranger where once stood her most trusted ally. You too, Margaret? After everything we've been through together, you now lecture me about the nature of royal authority? Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't back down. I lecture you because I love you, and because I see you destroying everything good that your reign has accomplished. You're isolating yourself from the very people who could help you solve these problems. The throne room fell silent again, but this time Isabella felt the weight of that silence like a physical blow. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, her son, her advisors, her guards, her closest friend, and saw doubt and concern in every expression. The realization that she stood alone in her convictions was both terrifying and infuriating. I see, Isabella said slowly, her voice deadly quiet. So this is how it ends. After 15 years of faithful service to this kingdom, after making the hard decisions that no one else wanted to make, I am now condemned by the very people who benefited from my strength. Alexander felt a stab of pain at the genuine hurt in his mother's voice. Despite their conflict, he loved her and respected much of what she had accomplished. But he also recognized that love sometimes required difficult honesty. Mother, this isn't condemnation, he said gently. This is an opportunity. The kingdom stands at a crossroads, and we can choose which path to take together. Your experience and wisdom, combined with a willingness to listen and adapt, could make this the greatest period of prosperity in Aldermere's history. Isabella studied her son's face, seeing the earnest conviction that reminded her so painfully of Frederick in his youth. Part of her wanted to embrace the possibility he offered, but another part of her, the part that had been hardened by years of making unpopular but necessary decisions, rejected the very idea that her methods needed changing. And if I refuse? Isabella asked quietly. If I continue to rule as I have ruled, what then? The question hung heavy in the air, and Alexander realized that his answer would determine not just their personal relationship, but the future of the entire kingdom. Captain Marcus shifted slightly at his post, understanding that this moment would define where his loyalties ultimately lay. The assembled nobles held their breath, knowing that they were witnessing a conversation that would reshape the political landscape of Aldermere. Alexander looked directly into his mother's eyes, seeing both the strong woman who had raised him and the stubborn ruler who was threatening to tear the kingdom apart. Then you will rule alone, mother. Alone and isolated while the kingdom crumbles around you. Isabella's face went ashen at her son's words. The stark prophecy of ruling alone while the kingdom crumbled struck her like a physical blow. For a moment, the throne room seemed to spin around her as she contemplated a future where her authority meant nothing because she had no one left to govern. The image was terrifying, but her pride refused to let her show weakness in front of the assembled court. "You threaten me?" she said, her voice barely controlled. "My own son threatens me with isolation and rebellion if I don't bow to his demands." Alexander shook his head sadly. "I'm not threatening you, Mother. I'm warning you. The choice is yours to make, but the consequences of that choice will affect every person in this kingdom, including you." Captain Marcus watched this exchange with growing unease. He had served the royal family faithfully for over a decade, but he was beginning to understand that his ultimate loyalty had to be to the stability and welfare of the realm itself. If the Queen's stubbornness led to civil war or widespread rebellion, his duty as a protector of Aldermere might require him to make choices that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. Lady Margaret stepped closer to the throne, her voice filled with desperate emotion. "Isabella, please listen to what everyone is telling you. We're not your enemies, we're your friends and advisors who see danger ahead. The Eastern Territories are just the beginning. If we don't address these problems now, they will spread throughout the entire kingdom." Isabella turned to stare at Margaret with eyes full of betrayal and hurt. "Friends don't abandon their friends in moments of crisis, Margaret. Friends don't join with rebellious sons to undermine their queen's authority. Friends also don't let friends destroy themselves out of misguided pride," Margaret replied firmly. "I've watched you become more isolated and suspicious with each passing year. You've stopped listening to advice, stopped trusting the people who care about you most, and started seeing enemies where there are only concerned allies." Lord Bartholomew stepped forward, his aged voice carrying the weight of decades of royal service. "Your Majesty, I've served this crown through 3 generations. I've seen what happens when rulers become too rigid to adapt to changing circumstances. The kingdom always suffers, and sometimes the crown falls entirely." Isabella felt the walls closing in around her as even her most senior advisor joined the chorus of criticism. "Are you threatening me too, Lord Bartholomew? Are you suggesting that my crown is in danger if I don't submit to this conspiracy?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Majesty," Lord Bartholomew replied calmly. "I'm stating a historical fact. Crowns that refuse to bend with the winds of change often break entirely." "That's not a threat? It's a lesson that history has taught us repeatedly?" Duke Edmund cleared his throat and spoke with careful diplomacy. "Your Majesty, perhaps we could view this situation differently. Instead of seeing the prince's concerns as challenges to your authority, we could see them as opportunities to strengthen your reign by addressing legitimate grievances before they become insurmountable problems." Isabella laughed bitterly. "You want me to reward rebellion by giving the rebels what they demand. You want me to show weakness in the face of defiance. How exactly does that strengthen my reign?" Alexander felt his patience beginning to fray as his mother continued to mischaracterize every attempt at reasoned discussion as either threat or betrayal. "Mother, showing strength doesn't mean being inflexible." Father's greatest victories came from his ability to adapt his strategies when circumstances changed. You're treating governance like warfare, where any compromise is defeat. "Perhaps because governance is warfare," Isabella snapped. "Every day I fight to maintain order, to preserve the stability that keeps this kingdom from descending into chaos. You want me to negotiate with chaos itself?" Captain Marcus found himself thinking about the reports from his men in the Eastern Territories. Reports that painted a picture of desperate people pushed beyond their limits rather than chaos-loving rebels, seeking to overthrow legitimate authority. The more he listened to this argument, the more he became convinced that the prince's assessment was closer to the truth than the queen's. "Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully. "With respect, the people in the Eastern Territories aren't seeking chaos. They're seeking relief from policies that have made their lives unbearable. My men report that the unrest could be calmed with relatively minor adjustments to taxation and grain distribution." Isabella turned on him with fury. "Minor adjustments? Captain, those taxes fund the military that protects this kingdom. That grain feeds the troops stationed on our borders. You're asking me to weaken our defenses to appease complainers. I'm asking you to balance our needs with theirs, Marcus replied steadily. A kingdom without the loyalty of its people cannot be defended, no matter how well funded its military. The statement hung in the air like a revelation, and Alexander seized upon it. Exactly. Mother, you're so focused on defending against external threats that you're creating internal ones. A kingdom that fears its own rulers is already defeated. Isabella felt the last vestiges of her support crumbling away. Even her military commander, the man responsible for protecting her life and throne, was now openly advocating for the very policies she had rejected. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, but beneath it lay a growing fear that perhaps they were all right and she was catastrophically wrong. So what would you have me do? Isabella asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. Abdicate in favor of my son? Admit that 15 years of my rule have been a failure? Alexander's expression softened as he heard the pain beneath his mother's defiant words. No, Mother. I want you to do what you've always done, lead this kingdom. But lead it forward, not backward. Lead it with wisdom and compassion, not just authority and tradition. Lady Margaret stepped even closer to the throne, reaching out as though she wanted to comfort her old friend. Isabella, no one is asking you to abandon everything you've built. We're asking you to build upon it, to grow and adapt as all great rulers must. Isabella looked around the throne room one more time, seeing the faces of people she had trusted and relied upon for years. The unity of their position was undeniable, and for the first time since this confrontation began, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that they might be right. The thought was terrifying because it meant acknowledging that her rigid adherence to traditional royal prerogatives might indeed be damaging the very kingdom she had sworn to protect. And if I try this new approach, Isabella said slowly, if I compromise and negotiate and show what you call flexibility, what happens when the next group of malcontents decides to test my resolve? What happens when every policy becomes subject to popular approval? How do I maintain any authority at all? Alexander smiled for the first time since entering the throne room, recognizing the question as a genuine inquiry rather than another defensive challenge. You maintain authority by earning it every day, Mother. By proving that your decisions serve the kingdom's welfare rather than just royal tradition. By showing that you're strong enough to change when change is needed. Isabella sat back on her throne, the weight of the crown feeling heavier than it had in years. For the first time since this confrontation began, she truly listened to the silence that followed her son's words. It was not the expectant silence of a court waiting for royal pronouncement, but the patient quiet of people who cared enough about their kingdom to risk their own positions by speaking difficult truths. Earning authority every day, she repeated quietly, testing the concept like a foreign language. Frederick used to say something similar. He said that the crown was not a possession but a responsibility that had to be renewed with each decision. Lady Margaret's eyes brightened with hope as she heard Isabella reference her late husband with something other than defensive comparison. He was wise in that understanding as he was in so many things. But wisdom doesn't diminish when it's shared between rulers, Isabella. Your experience combined with Alexander's fresh perspective could be incredibly powerful. Alexander took a cautious step closer to the throne, sensing the subtle shift in his mother's demeanor. Mother, I've never wanted to replace you or diminish your achievements. I want to learn from you while also bringing new ideas to help solve the problems we're facing. The kingdom needs both your experience and a willingness to try different approaches. Isabella studied her son's face, seeing the earnest sincerity that she had often dismissed as naive idealism. But perhaps naivety and idealism weren't entirely bad qualities in a future ruler, especially when tempered by the hard-won wisdom of an experienced queen. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over distant mountains. The Eastern Territories, Isabella said finally. Tell me exactly what you think should be done. The question carried a weight that everyone in the throne room understood. It was not quite surrender, but it was the first crack in the wall of rigid authority that Isabella had built around herself. Captain Marcus straightened slightly, recognizing that his queen was finally preparing to listen rather than simply react. Alexander chose his words carefully, understanding that this moment could determine whether their confrontation led to reconciliation or permanent fracture. Reduce the emergency tax by half and redistribute grain from the royal reserves to the affected villages. Send a delegation to meet with their leaders, not to negotiate with rebels, but to hear the legitimate concerns of your subjects. Most importantly, implement a system for ongoing communication so problems can be addressed before they become crises. Isabella frowned, her political instincts warring with her growing recognition that change might be necessary. The emergency tax funds our border defenses against King Roland's potential aggression. Cutting it in half could leave us vulnerable to external threats. Duke Edmund stepped forward with a slight bow. Your Majesty, our intelligence suggests that King Roland's aggressive posturing is partly motivated by his belief that internal unrest makes us weak. Resolving the Eastern Territories crisis could actually strengthen our position against external threats. Lord Bartholomew nodded in agreement. A unified kingdom presents a much stronger front to potential enemies than a divided one. The tax revenue lost from the Eastern Territories could be offset by increased trade and productivity once stability is restored. Isabella felt her carefully, constructed worldview shifting like sand beneath her feet. These men had advised her through numerous challenges, and their counsel had generally served her well. If they were all convinced that flexibility would strengthen rather than weaken her position, perhaps her fears of appearing weak were misguided. And you believe that showing such flexibility won't encourage similar demands from other regions? Isabella asked, still grappling with the fundamental shift in thinking they were proposing. Alexander shook his head. Not if we address the underlying causes of discontent rather than just the symptoms. The Eastern Territories aren't rebelling because they enjoy defying authority, Mother. They're rebelling because they feel abandoned by that authority. Show them that you hear their concerns and respond to legitimate needs, and you'll have more loyal subjects than ever before. Captain Marcus found himself nodding at the prince's words. Your Majesty, my men consistently report that the common people want to be loyal to the crown. They're not seeking to overthrow the monarchy, they're seeking confirmation that the monarchy cares about their welfare. Isabella closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the full weight of 15 years of increasingly isolated rule pressing down upon her. She thought about the early years of her reign, when she had been more open to advice, more willing to consider different perspectives. Somewhere along the way, the constant pressure of royal responsibility had hardened her into someone who saw compromise as weakness and questioning as betrayal. I have been afraid, she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible in the vast throne room. Afraid that any sign of flexibility would be seen as weakness, that any compromise would invite further challenges to royal authority. I have ruled through fear because I was afraid myself. The admission struck the assembled court like lightning. Queen Isabella, who had projected unwavering strength and absolute confidence for 15 years, had just revealed the human vulnerability beneath the crown. Lady Margaret felt tears gathering in her eyes as she recognized her old friend emerging from behind the fortress of royal protocol. Alexander moved closer to his mother's throne, his voice gentle but firm. Fear is not weakness, Mother. Fear becomes weakness only when it prevents us from doing what's right. You've protected this kingdom for 15 years because you cared enough to be afraid of making the wrong choices. That same care can guide us toward making better choices now. Isabella opened her eyes and looked directly at her son, seeing not the rebellious challenge to her authority that she had imagined, but a future king who had learned from her strengths while recognizing the need to overcome her limitations. The pride she felt in that moment was tinged with sadness for the years of unnecessary conflict between them. Very well, Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with decision. We will try your approach, Alexander. But we will try it together, not as queen and rebellious prince, but as experienced ruler and heir apparent working toward the same goal. The throne room erupted in barely contained relief and approval. Lord Bartholomew smiled for the first time in months, while Duke Edmund and the other nobles began to envision solutions rather than escalating problems. Captain Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders ease as he realized that his loyalty to crown and kingdom could once again point in the same direction. Lady Margaret stepped forward and took Isabella's hand, their friendship restored in that simple gesture. Together, you two will be formidable leaders. The kingdom will benefit immensely from this partnership. Alexander bowed formally to his mother, but his eyes were warm with affection and respect. Thank you, Mother, for listening, for being willing to change, and for showing me that true strength sometimes requires admitting our fears and growing beyond them. Isabella stood from her throne and descended the marble steps to stand beside her son. For the first time in years, she felt not like a besieged fortress defending against all challenges, but like a wise ruler with trusted allies working toward common goals. The crown still rested on her head, but it no longer felt like a burden she carried alone. Tomorrow, Isabella announced to the court, Prince Alexander and I will depart for the Eastern Territories together. We will see the situation with our own eyes, speak with our subjects directly, and work together to find solutions that serve both royal authority and popular welfare. As the court began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about this unprecedented development, Isabella reflected on how different the throne room felt now. The same marble floors, the same soaring ceiling, the same golden throne, but somehow everything had changed. She had learned that true authority came not from isolation and inflexibility, but from the courage to listen, adapt, and grow alongside the kingdom she served.